won the earthquake that shook Jerusalem. It was a day unlike any other. The city of Jerusalem was teeming with tension. The air was heavy, and an unusual silence hung over the streets. Something was about to happen, something that would change the history of humanity forever. Suddenly, a deep tremor took over the city. The ground began to move violently. Cracks opened in the stone roads, and the buildings shook as if they were mere toys in the hands of an invisible force. The deafening roar of the earth breaking apart echoed through the valleys, sending panic into the hearts of everyone there. People screamed, ran, sought shelter wherever they could, but nothing seemed safe. The temple, imposing and majestic, trembled with the force of the tremor. Priests fell to the ground, while sacred utensils were thrown everywhere. In the center of the city, the Roman soldiers, men accustomed to the brutality of war, were paralyzed by fear. They had faced fierce enemies before, but they had never seen the earth itself rise up against them. But what could have caused such a devastating earthquake? This was no ordinary natural event. There were no signs, no warning. The explanation was clear to those who had eyes to see. The Son of God had just given up his spirit. All creation was responding to the Savior's sacrifice. Jesus, hanging on the cross, breathed his last, and at that moment the world shook. It was as if the earth itself was weeping, as if the death of the just one was such an injustice that even the stones revolted. The earthquake was not just a physical phenomenon, but a divine sign. And then, something even more amazing happened. Tombs began to open. Yes, the tombs were split in two, and many who had died were resurrected. Imagine the impact of that. People who had been buried were now alive again, walking the streets of Jerusalem. This was an undeniable testimony to the power of God. The earthquake marked the moment when the world was shaken spiritually. Even Christ's enemies realized that something supernatural was happening. The Roman centurion who had overseen the crucifixion was terrified and declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Now think about it. If even the Roman soldiers who did not know the scriptures recognized Jesus' power in the face of this event, what does that mean for you? Are we paying attention to God's signs in our lives? Can we see that Christ's death was a turning point for all of humanity? The earthquake that shook Jerusalem was a physical reflection of what happened spiritually. That day, the world would never be the same again. The cross was not the end, but the beginning of a new era. Have you allowed this truth to shake your life? If this message resonated with you, don't leave without subscribing to the channel. Let's explore more about these incredible events that mark the history of the world together. Like and share, so that more people are impacted. See you in the next video. The veil of the temple is torn in two. The Temple of Jerusalem was the heart of the Jewish faith, a grand structure, a symbol of God's presence among his people. But within it there was a special place, inaccessible to almost everyone, the Holy of Holies. This sacred space was separated by an immense veil, a thick curtain made of heavy fabric which prevented anyone from seeing what was inside. Only the high priest was allowed to enter, and this happened only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. God's presence was something distant, unattainable, but on that day, something impossible happened. At the exact moment Jesus took his last breath, the earth shook violently. The air seemed to grow heavy, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then, without any natural explanation, a sound tore through the silence, a deep, frightening sound. The veil of the temple, that barrier between God and men, was torn from top to bottom. It was not a simple tear, it was not a small cut. It was torn in half, as if unseen hands had torn it apart. Imagine the scene. The priests who were in the temple at that moment must have been terrified. They knew that this was not the work of man. No man could tear that veil, much less from top to bottom. It was a sign, a clear and powerful sign. Something had changed forever. But what did it mean? The veil separated the people from the presence of God. It represented the distance between a holy God and sinful humanity. But with the death of Christ, that separation was destroyed. The cross became the bridge that connected God to men. Now anyone, anywhere, could approach the Father. The sacrifice was complete. The way to God was open. For the religious people of the time, this was a shock. For centuries, they had followed the rules, offered sacrifices, and tried to achieve holiness through rituals. But suddenly, all of this seemed obsolete. The true Lamb had been slain. The ultimate sacrifice had been made. What about you? Do you still live as if there were a veil separating you from God? Do you still believe that you need to be perfect to approach Him? The truth is that Jesus has already removed that barrier. The price has been paid, the debt has been settled. All you need to do is accept this gift and approach the Father with confidence. The tearing of the veil was one of the greatest signs of that day, a sign that everything had changed. But are we living this change, or are we still acting as if we were stuck in the past? If this message touched you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Let's continue exploring these incredible events that mark the history of humanity. Like and share so that more people are impacted. See you in the next video. 3 Darkness over the earth. The sun shone brightly over Jerusalem. It was noon, the time when the light should be at its peak. But then, something inexplicable began to happen. The sky, which had previously been clear, began to change. Dark clouds advanced like living shadows, covering the sun with frightening speed. The light disappeared before the astonished eyes of those there. Day turned into night. Those passing by Golgotha looked up, confused. The Roman soldiers squinted, trying to understand what was happening. The air itself seemed heavier, denser, as if something invisible was pressing down on everything around it. For 3 hours, a deep darkness covered the earth. It was not an eclipse. It was not an ordinary storm. It was something supernatural. The priests in the temple stopped their tasks. People in the marketplaces stopped. An eerie silence fell over the city. It was as if the world itself was in mourning. Something great was happening, but few understood it. On the cross, Jesus suffered. He felt not only the physical pain of the nails and the crown of thorns, but something far worse, separation from the Father. The weight of humanity's sin was upon him. The darkened sky was a reflection of what was happening in the spiritual world. God was pouring out on His Son all the wrath that was destined for us. The darkness was a sign, a warning that this was no ordinary moment. Nature responded to the Creator's suffering. It was as if all creation was weeping for its Lord. But the religious leaders scoffed. Some ignored it, believing it was just a strange phenomenon. Little did they know that they were witnessing one of the most important moments in history. And then, at exactly 3 in the afternoon, Jesus broke the silence. With a loud voice, He cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That sentence echoed through the hearts of everyone there. Can you imagine the weight of that moment? The Son of God Himself, the one who had always been in perfect communion with the Father, now felt abandoned. But He knew the reason. He was taking our place, carrying our guilt, and that is why the darkness over the earth was not just a natural phenomenon. It was a warning, a milestone, a visible sign that something great was happening. The world would never be the same again. If this story touched you, don't leave without subscribing to the channel. Like and share this video so that more people understand the power of that moment. See you in the next episode of this epic journey. 4. The dead who resurrected the air was dense, charged with an energy that no one could explain. Jerusalem had been shaken by an earthquake. The sky had darkened supernaturally, and now something even more frightening was happening. Between the city streets and the surrounding fields, some graves began to open. The ground split, and the impossible happened before the astonished eyes of the crowd. In the surroundings of the temple, the tombs of the righteous, those who had served God in life, began to move. The sepulchral silence was broken by the sound of the earth giving way, of the rolling of stones and footsteps. Yes, footsteps. What had previously been only memories and longing now took shape again. The city's residents screamed in terror as they saw figures emerging from the tombs. Some fell to their knees, others ran in despair. Those who had been gone for years, perhaps decades, were standing again. But they were not dark specters or ghosts. They were not there to bring fear, but to witness something great. They walked through the city, recognizing family and friends, and proclaiming that something extraordinary had happened. They were saints, faithful people who had waited for God's promise, and now they were back as an undeniable sign of the power that had just been manifested on the cross. The connection was clear. Jesus, the Son of God, had just given up his spirit, and in that moment, the gates of death were shaken. The resurrection was already beginning to manifest itself, pointing to something much greater that was to come. If those who had departed were coming back to life, what else could happen? The priests in the temple tried to deny the obvious. The Roman soldiers were perplexed. The people did not know whether to weep or rejoice. Jerusalem was facing an event that no one could erase from history. And here is the great lesson. Death no longer had the same power. Jesus' sacrifice was not just an act of pain and suffering, but of victory. If the earth shook and the dead were resurrected, it was because a new era was beginning. Can you imagine being in Jerusalem that day? What would you do if you saw someone who had already departed walking among the living again? If this story made sense to you, don't leave without subscribing to the channel. Like and share this powerful story so that more people know the truth behind these epic events. See you in the next episode. The Roman soldier who recognized Jesus. The battle was over. Not a battle of swords and shields, but a fight between light and darkness. Jesus' body hung lifeless on the cross. The sky remained dark. The veil of the temple was torn. The earth still shook from time to time, and rumors about the dead rising again spread quickly through Jerusalem. Something unprecedented had happened, and in the midst of this chaos, one man stood out, a Roman soldier, a centurion who had witnessed executions countless times. He was not a mere spectator, but someone accustomed to brutality. Perhaps he had been one of those who had whipped Jesus. Perhaps he had helped to drive the nails. Perhaps he had laughed as they condemned him. But now, standing before the cross, everything was different. His gaze was fixed on the inert body of the Nazarene. The man who, even in the face of the most unbearable pain, had not cursed, had not begged for mercy, had not cursed his executioners. On the contrary, he had prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The centurion's mind was in turmoil. He had seen many criminals crucified, and most of them had screamed with hatred, cursing their executioners until their last breath. But this man was different. He was not a criminal. And then came the final blow, the darkness, the earthquake, the opening of the graves. None of it was normal. None of it could be explained as a mere coincidence. The entire universe seemed to mourn what had just happened. And at that moment, the soldier's hardened heart was broken. The man who had always trusted in the strength of the empire was now on his knees before the truth. He raised his face to the sky and exclaimed with a certainty that not even he could fully understand, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." The confession of a Roman soldier echoed through the centuries. A man trained to kill, to obey without question, now acknowledged what many religious leaders refused to accept. And here is the most shocking point of this story. While the disciples were hiding, while the priests tried to ignore the signs, while the people still wondered what it all meant, a Roman soldier, a foreigner, an enemy of the Jews, was the first to recognize Jesus as the Son of God after his death. This shows that divine revelation does not choose class, status, or religion. It reaches even the most unlikely hearts. What about you? If you had been there at the foot of the cross, would you have recognized Jesus? If this story touched you, don't leave without subscribing to the channel. Leave your like and share so that more people know this powerful truth. See you in the next episode.